Chapter 9. The Buried Secret. Harold Pemberton was making grilled cheese when he died. The 70-year-old widower moved with the careful precision of someone who'd lived alone for 8 years, who'd learned to find comfort in small rituals. Tomato soup simmering on the stove, filling his second-floor apartment with the warm scent of basil. 2 slices of cheddar between buttered bread sizzling in the cast-iron skillet his late wife had seasoned for 40 years. A glass of Cabernet breathing on the counter. Tuesday evening, like every Tuesday evening for as long as he could remember. Through the window, Main Street stretched quiet beneath November streetlights. His building, 3 stories of brick built in 1924. 2 retail spaces below, 3 apartments above, stood solid and familiar. Harold had owned it for 32 years, had raised a family in this very apartment, had watched the town change and evolve from this same window. The retail spaces had housed a pharmacy, a bookstore, a coffee shop, an antique store. Businesses came and went, but the building endured. Ian Martin wanted it desperately. The young real estate developer had been circling for months, making increasingly aggressive offers. First reasonable, then generous, then frankly absurd. Harold kept refusing, not because he was particularly attached to the property. He'd thought about downsizing, maybe moving to the senior apartments near the park, but because Ian's desperation made him uncomfortable. Something's wrong with that young man, Harold had told Dr. McMasters during his last checkup. He has the eyes of someone drowning. Connor had made a non-committal sound, written something in Harold's chart, changed the subject. Harold hadn't thought much of it at the time. He flipped the grilled cheese, watched butter pool golden in the pan. His classic movie for tonight was already queued up, Casablanca, which he'd seen at least 50 times. After dinner, he'd go up to the rooftop garden he maintained, check on the herbs he was nursing through autumn, maybe water the hardy mums that still held a few russet blooms. Simple pleasures. A simple life. Harold had learned after his wife died that contentment came from small things, from routines and rituals, from appreciating what remained rather than mourning what was lost. The sound of splintering wood came from downstairs. Harold froze, spatula in hand. The back service entrance, the lock he kept meaning to replace but never quite got around to. Heavy footsteps on the stairs, deliberate but unsteady. Someone who'd been drinking. "Hello?" Harold called out, his voice uncertain. "The building's closed for the evening. If you need..." His apartment door burst inward, the simple lock giving way with barely any resistance. Ian Martin stood in the doorway, wild-eyed and swaying slightly, reeking of whiskey, a crowbar in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. Not stumbling drunk, but drunk enough to blur his already fractured judgment. Harold's first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion. Concern, even. "Mr. Martin? What are you? Are you all right? You look..." Ian crossed the room in 3 strides. The knife entered Harold's chest, just below his sternum, a punch of cold fire that stole his breath. Harold stumbled backward, his hand coming up instinctively to push Ian away, to stop this, to understand what was happening. The spatula clattered to the floor. Behind him, the grilled cheese began to burn. "I'm sorry," Ian was saying, or maybe sobbing. I'm sorry. I need you to stay dead." Harold tried to speak, but blood filled his mouth. He'd fought in Korea, had carried wounded men through the snow at Chosin Reservoir, had seen death up close. He recognized it now, felt it spreading cold through his chest. But survival instinct kicked in. That stubborn determination that had carried him through war and cancer and 8 years of widowhood. He tried to push Ian away, tried to make it to the door, to his phone, to anywhere. Ian panicked. The second stab hit Harold's shoulder, scraping bone. The third caught him in the stomach. Harold fell to his knees, his hands pressed uselessly against wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, looking up at the young man who was killing him. Ian's face was twisted with something beyond rage. Terror, maybe. Or madness. "Why?" Harold managed to whisper through blood. Ian couldn't answer. He didn't know anymore. He just kept stabbing. Chest, stomach, back, shoulders, wherever the knife found purchase. Harold's vision was darkening, the pain becoming distant, almost abstract. He thought about his wife, about seeing her again soon. He thought about his daughter in Seattle, about the grandchildren he'd visited last Christmas. He thought about his rooftop garden, about who would water his mums. The 14th stab barely registered. By the 17th, Harold Pemberton was gone. Ian stood over the body, breathing hard, covered in blood. The apartment looked like a slaughterhouse. Crimson splatter decorated the walls in arterial arcs. The floor was slick with it. Harold's body lay crumpled near the stove, where the grilled cheese had burned black and the soup was starting to scorch. This wasn't clean. This wasn't the careful planning of his first murders. This was butchery born of desperation and the terrible certainty that nothing he did could stop his victims from coming back. Ian staggered to the bathroom on legs that felt disconnected from his body. He tried to wash the blood off, realized he'd left it everywhere. Footprints, handprints, great smears across surfaces. His shirt was drenched. His jeans were sticky with it. The smell, copper and meat and something worse, made his gorge rise. He stripped, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work his belt. Washed his hands and arms and face in water that turned pink, then red, then pink again. Found a jacket in Harold's closet, worn corduroy, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco, and pulled it on over his bare torso. Stuffed his bloody clothes into a garbage bag he found under the sink. The back stairs, the service entrance. His car parked 3 blocks away where security cameras wouldn't catch it. Ian moved through these steps mechanically, his mind white with static. The world felt distant, muffled, like he was moving through water. He drove to a shopping centre 15 minutes outside Millbrook, found a dumpster behind a closed furniture store, threw the garbage bag deep into commercial waste, then sat in his car and started crying. Not from remorse exactly, but from the terrible realization that he'd become something monstrous. The man who started this wanting money and status was gone. What was left was a killer who stabbed old men 17 times in their own kitchens, who couldn't trust death itself to stay permanent. Ian drove home, showered until the hot water ran cold, put on clean clothes, poured himself a drink with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, sat in his living room with all the lights on, afraid of what might be waiting in the shadows. 17 stab wounds. 17. Surely death would stick this time. Surely Harold Pemberton wouldn't come knocking on his door next Tuesday, asking why Ian had killed him. Surely Harold's body wasn't discovered until Wednesday afternoon, when a tenant complained about a smell, and the landlord used his key. By then, Ian had almost convinced himself it was just another nightmare. Connor arrived at Harold's building Wednesday evening, called by Chief Rodriguez to consult on what was clearly the most brutal crime Millbrook had seen in decades. The police chief had known Connor could help establish time of death and wound patterns, and Connor had assisted with forensic consultations before, just part of being the town's most trusted physician. Nothing prepared him for the scene. Yellow police tape blocked the second-floor hallway. Officers moved through the apartment with grim efficiency, photographing, documenting, bagging evidence. The smell hit Connor first. Blood and death. Familiar enough after centuries of life, but never pleasant. Then he saw the apartment itself. Massacre site. Harold's body still lay on the floor, covered now with a sheet that couldn't hide the outline of his position. Blood splatter on the walls in patterns Connor could read like text. Arterial spray, cast off from the weapon. Smears where Harold had tried to crawl. The kitchen showed signs of Harold's last meal, the burned grilled cheese, still in the pan. Soup congealed and blackened. Connor stood in the doorway and felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. Genuine, overwhelming rage. This wasn't clever. This wasn't calculated. This was a man coming completely apart, killing with mindless brutality. Connor had watched humanity's capacity for violence for 4 centuries, had seen wars and plagues and casual cruelties beyond counting. But there was something particularly offensive about this. The overkill, the panic, evident in the wound patterns, the sheer waste of it. Harold had been a good man, a kind man, someone who'd served his country and community, who'd survived war and loss and illness, who deserved better than bleeding out on his kitchen floor while a desperate coward stabbed him 17 times. Connor's hands clenched into fists, his carefully maintained composure cracking. "Doc?" Rodriguez appeared beside him, his weathered face pale. "You okay? I know Harold was your patient, but you don't have to." "I'm fine," Connor said, his voice colder than Rodriguez had ever heard it. "Just give me a moment." Rodriguez stepped back, giving Connor space. After 15 years of friendship, the police chief had learned to read Dr. McMaster's moods. And right now, The usually warm and affable doctor looked like a man capable of violence himself. Connor forced himself to breathe, to push down the anger, to remember who he was supposed to be. He stepped into the apartment, moving carefully around the blood, approaching Harold's body with professional detachment. 17 stab wounds, he counted. Multiple defensive wounds on the hands and forearms where Harold tried to protect himself. Wounds to the chest, abdomen, back, shoulders. Frenzied attack. Prolonged. Excessive. Death would have come from blood loss and shock. Probably took several minutes. Long minutes of terror and pain. Time of death? Rodriguez asked quietly. Based on liver temperature and rigor, sometime last night, between 7 and 10 p.m. would be my estimate. Connor stood, looked around the apartment. He was making dinner. Whoever did this surprised him. Attacked without warning. Any idea who? Ian Martin. Connor said it without hesitation. You'll find he's been trying to buy this building. Harold refused. Check Ian's finances. I suspect you'll find debt, desperation, motive. Rodriguez looked startled. Doc, that's a serious accusation. You have evidence? Check his other property acquisitions, cross-reference with unusual deaths in the past year. Connor met Rodriguez's eyes. Trust me on this. Ian Martin is your killer. The police chief nodded slowly. Dr. McMasters had never steered him wrong before. I'll look into it. But Doc, you seem awful certain. Harold told me Ian was desperate. Not quite a lie. And this, Connor gestured at the carnage. This is what desperation looks like. He provided the forensic details Rodriguez needed, maintaining his professional demeanor even as rage simmered beneath. As he left the scene, walking past officers and crime scene techs and neighbours clustered on the sidewalk, Connor made a decision. This ends soon. No more waiting for Ian to kill again. No more psychological torture. The game is over. Now comes judgment. Now came judgment. Connor returned to the morgue at 3 a.m. Harold's body lay on a steel table, cleaned now, the wounds catalogued and photographed. The coroner had gone home hours ago, leaving Connor alone with the dead man and the ritual he'd performed 8 times before. This one would be harder. 17 wounds meant 17 pathways death had used to claim Harold. 17 connections Connor would have to reverse. 17 threads to pull back from the darkness. The incantation would take longer, require more power, leave him drained in ways he hadn't felt in decades. Connor lit the candles. Black for death, white for life, red for blood. Traced the circle around Harold's body with practiced precision. Began the words in Old Irish, the language of his childhood, 600 years ago, the tongue that had first called the dead to return. Tar ar eis on dushadas, come back from the darkness. The ritual fought him. 17 wounds, 17 gates death had entered through, each one sealed tight. Connor poured more power into the words, felt his own life force flowing into Harold's cooling flesh, bridging the gap between death and life. An hour passed. 2. Connor's voice grew hoarse, his hands shaking with effort. This was taking more than any resurrection before it, costing more than he'd anticipated. But he wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. Harold deserved this second chance. Finally, as dawnlight began filtering through the morgue's high windows, Harold's chest hitched with a sudden breath. And he started screaming. Not the confused panic of other resurrections. This was genuine, primal terror. The sound of a man reliving 17 stab wounds, every moment of pain and betrayal compressed into a single endless instant. Harold's body arched on the table, his hands clawing at his chest where wounds used to be, where flesh was now smooth and whole, but memory insisted damage remained. Connor grabbed Harold's shoulders, holding him down as gently as he could. Harold, you're safe. You're alive. Listen to my voice. You're safe. Harold fought him, lost in trauma, seeing not Connor but Ian Martin with his knife, feeling the blade enter again and again and again. His screams dissolved into wordless sobs, his body shaking. With such violence, Connor feared he might hurt himself. Tatu sabhailti anuais, Connor said urgently, speaking in English and Irish both, switching between languages instinctively. Tatu beo. Tatu chart go leor. You're alive. Harold, you're safe. I brought you back. Gradually, painfully, Harold's panic subsided enough for him to hear. his eyes focused on Connor, recognition dawning slowly through the trauma. "Dr. McMasters?" His voice was raw from screaming. He killed me. Ian Martin. He stabbed me." "I know, but you're alive now. I brought you back." Connor helped Harold sit up slowly, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "I know this is impossible to understand right now, but you're safe. You're in the hospital morgue. It's Thursday morning, and I have so much to explain." The explanation came in fits and starts, complicated by Harold's shock and residual terror. The drive to Connor's farmhouse passed in a blur, Harold barely registering the journey. When they arrived, Eleanor was waiting. Connor had called ahead, warned her this resurrection had gone badly. 5 other people sat in Connor's living room, all of them familiar from his patient roster, all of them supposedly dead. Harold looked at them with confusion that slowly shifted to horrified understanding. "We all died," Eleanor said gently, her principal's voice calm and steady. "Ian Martin killed us all, and Dr. McMasters brought us back. I know how this sounds. I know what you're feeling. We've all been exactly where you are now." Thomas approached carefully, showing Harold his neck where ligature marks should have been. "He strangled me. I remember dying, and I remember waking up, just like you." Margaret took Harold's hand. "Poisoned tea. And now I'm here." One by one, they shared their stories. 5 people, 5 murders, 5 impossible resurrections. Harold listened, trembling, occasionally touching his chest, where the wounds had been, where his shirt showed no damage, even though he remembered blood, so much blood. When Eleanor led him to a guest room, Harold followed like a sleepwalker. She sat with him, speaking softly about trauma and survival, and the community they'd built from impossible circumstances. Connor stood in the doorway, watching Harold shake and weep, and felt guilt settle heavy in his chest. He'd started this as a game, resurrecting victims for entertainment and revenge. A puzzle to solve, a way to break the monotony of immortality. He'd resurrected victims for his own amusement, for the satisfaction of watching Ian unravel, for the thrill of exercising power he usually kept hidden. But he'd created a community of traumatized people. And Harold's suffering, the screaming, the terror, the fresh horror of violent death, was partially Connor's fault. If he'd stopped Ian sooner, if he'd prioritized safety over entertainment, Harold would never have died that horrible death. The anger Connor had felt at the crime scene turned inward, sharp and accusing. He'd been playing God, treating people's deaths and resurrections as pieces in his personal chess game. It was time to end it, properly and permanently, before anyone else paid the price for his entertainment. By evening, Connor's farmhouse felt more like a refugee camp than a home. 6 resurrected people, all trying to navigate impossible circumstances while hidden from the world they used to know. The living room was too small for all of them, so they'd spilled into the kitchen, the dining room, even out onto the back porch, despite November's chill. The tension was palpable. These weren't people who'd chosen to be together. They were bound by trauma and impossibility. Strangers thrust into intimacy by death and resurrection. Arguments had been breaking out all day over small things. Who would cook dinner? Who got which bedroom? Whether they could risk calling family members. The stress of hiding, of not existing in any official capacity, was wearing on everyone. Harold's screaming resurrection had shattered whatever fragile equilibrium they'd achieved. Before, they could almost pretend this was manageable, survivable. But seeing Harold's terror, hearing his screams echo through the farmhouse at dawn, had reminded them all of what they'd endured. Death wasn't an abstraction anymore. It was visceral, immediate, real. Connor called a meeting because they needed structure, needed plans, needed something more than just hiding and waiting for the next crisis. Eleanor tried to maintain order, positioning herself at the head of Connor's dining room table with the unconscious authority of someone who'd managed hundreds of faculty meetings. But even her formidable will was strained. Lines of exhaustion marked her face. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night with Harold, then mediating disputes between other residents through the day. Harold sat wrapped in a blanket in the corner, barely present, occasionally touching his chest where the wounds had been. His eyes were distant, haunted. He'd stopped screaming, but hadn't started healing. Not really. Every sudden noise made him flinch. Every shadow in the corner of his vision might be Ian Martin with a knife. Thomas was having his own PTSD episode, Harold's trauma triggering memories of his own death. The ligature marks might have healed, but the sensation of suffocation remained vivid in his mind. He sat rigid in his chair, jaw clenched, hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles were white. The smell of Harold's fear had awakened something in Thomas. Combat memories, survival instinct. The hair-trigger tension of someone who'd learned that death could come at any moment. Margaret cried quietly at the kitchen table, overwhelmed by the violence that seemed to permeate every corner of this nightmare. She was a gentle woman, a librarian who'd lived a quiet life, and the brutality of Harold's murder, the sheer excess of it, had broken something in her. She kept thinking about her daughter, about going home, about whether she could ever feel safe again. Rebecca paced the living room, her lips moving in constant prayer. She'd been trying to make sense of her resurrection through faith, to find God's purpose in being brought back. But Harold's screaming had shaken even her conviction. What kind of divine plan included such brutal violence? What mercy required such suffering before resurrection? David stood by the window, arms crossed, radiating frustration. He was a man of action, a problem solver, and being forced to hide and wait was driving him insane. He'd spent the day making lists, planning scenarios, calculating risks, anything to feel like he had some control over the situation. And Jennifer Wu sat taking notes in her usual corner, her journalist's instinct to document everything warring with the human need to simply process the impossible. She'd been watching Connor all day, trying to reconcile the warm, friendly doctor she'd known for years with an immortal necromancer who'd orchestrated this entire situation. Her notebook was filling with observations, questions, fragments of overheard conversations, the raw material of a story that could never be published because no one would believe it. "We can't keep doing this," David said, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the room. His voice was sharp, cutting. 8 of us. 8 murder attempts. We have enough evidence to go to police right now." "Evidence?" Thomas looked up, his voice rough. "What evidence? We're all walking around without a scratch. No wounds, no scars, nothing." "Our testimony," David started. "And say what?" Connor countered wearily. "That you all died and I brought you back with magic? They'll commit us all to psychiatric care. Best case scenario, you're all considered unreliable witnesses with shared delusion. Worst case, they section me, and you all lose the only person who knows what really happened. Then we don't mention the resurrections." David's frustration was boiling over. "We say we survived, that Ian attacked us, but we lived. 6 attempted murder charges. That's enough to put him away." "Is it?" Eleanor interrupted, her principal's voice calm but firm. 6 people claiming attempted murder with no physical evidence, no wounds, no proof of attack, nothing but our word. Ian has money, connections, lawyers. He'll claim we're delusional, or lying, or part of some conspiracy against him. "I have scars," Thomas said quietly, touching his neck where ligature marks had long since healed. "Except I don't anymore. Connor's magic erased them. We're perfect victims. No evidence, no proof, just impossible stories that make us sound crazy." "You tell her the truth," Rebecca said firmly, her faith unwavering. "God performed a miracle. Dr. McMasters is an instrument of divine will. We were brought back to serve a purpose." "God?" One of the others spoke up, voice sharp with bitterness. "God let me get murdered. Let all of us get murdered. Where was the divine purpose when I died? When everything went dark?" "God gives us free will," Rebecca started. "Don't," the speaker cut her off. "Don't give me theology right now. I'm not in the mood for explanations about mysterious ways." The room was dissolving into overlapping arguments now. One of the other patients muttered something about not being able to call family. Margaret was crying harder. Thomas suggested they handle this themselves, his military training offering solutions Connor couldn't allow. David was insisting they needed to act now, immediately, before Ian killed someone else. "What about witnesses?" Jennifer Wu spoke up, her journalist's mind cutting through the emotional chaos. "Ian must have left traces. He can't have killed 6 people without someone noticing something. Unusual property transactions, financial desperation, witnesses who saw him near the crime scenes." "She's right," David seized on this. We approach this strategically. Build a case the old-fashioned way. Evidence, witness statements, financial records. Then, when we come forward, we have corroboration. That takes time, Thomas objected. Weeks, maybe months. Meanwhile, Ian's out there, getting more desperate, more dangerous. What if he kills someone else while we're building a case? Then we stop him, Connor said quietly. The room fell silent, everyone turning to look at him. We've been reactive this whole time, waiting for Ian to kill, then bringing victims back. But Eleanor's right. No more resurrections after the fact. We need prevention, not reaction. How? Margaret asked, her voice small. How do we stop him without exposing ourselves? Connor didn't have an answer. Ian was unraveling, unpredictable. They couldn't watch him 24 hours a day. They couldn't warn potential victims without explaining how they knew. They couldn't go to the police without proof. They were trapped in an impossible situation of Connor's own making. We need options, Eleanor said, taking control of the conversation again. Actual options, not just arguments. Let's think this through systematically. Enough. Eleanor's principal voice cut through the chaos like a blade. This is getting us nowhere. We need a plan, not panic. This isn't your story anymore, Doctor, she continued, turning to Connor. It's ours. We died. We came back. What happens next should be our choice, not yours. Connor felt the weight of 7 pairs of eyes on him. She was right. He'd made decisions for all of them, to resurrect them, to hide them, to use them in his game against Ian. But their lives, their choices, their agency, those belonged to them. You're right, he said quietly. What do you want to do? The discussion that followed was heated but necessary. Each person had different needs, different fears, different hopes for how this would end. Slowly, with Eleanor's facilitation, a consensus began to emerge. They needed to stop Ian before he killed again. They needed to do it in a way that brought legal justice, not just revenge. They needed to protect themselves and each other. And they needed a plan that accounted for the fact that they couldn't explain the resurrections without sounding insane. One more thing, Eleanor said as the discussion wound down. We can't let him kill again. If Ian targets someone else before we're ready, we protect them. No more resurrections after the fact. Prevention, not reaction. Connor nodded, though privately he doubted they could predict Ian's next move. Ian was unraveling, unpredictable, more dangerous now than when he'd started killing. Connor agrees to the compromise, though he's lost his enthusiasm for the game. What started as entertainment has become responsibility. Heavy, complicated, human responsibility that his 4 centuries of detachment didn't prepare him for. As the resurrected patients dispersed to their rooms, Connor's farmhouse feeling more crowded with each passing hour, he sat alone in his living room, feeling the weight of 400 years pressing down. He'd saved 6 people from death, given them second lives, but he'd also put them through trauma that might never fully heal. The price of his entertainment had been paid in blood and suffering, and Connor was beginning to understand he could never make that balance even. Morning brought calmer heads, but no easier answers. Connor called another meeting, this time structured more carefully with Eleanor's help. They needed a concrete plan, not just reactive arguments. The 6 resurrected patients gathered around Connor's dining room table. Too small for everyone, so some stood, some sat on the floor. Jennifer Wu sat in the corner with her notebook, documenting everything. Connor wondered what she thought of all this, what story she'd write if they survived this mess. Here's what we know. Connor began laying out the facts with clinical precision. Ian Martin has murdered 6 people for their properties. He's drowning in debt. He's psychologically deteriorating. And he's escalated from careful kills to brutal overkill. The resurrections have destabilized him, making him paranoid and unpredictable. He's going to kill again, David stated flatly. Soon, someone's going to trigger his desperation, and we'll have victim number 9. Unless we stop him first, Thomas added, his voice steadier today than it had been last night. Connor outlined the possibilities they had discussed in fragments over the past 24 hours, organising them into concrete options. Option 1. Go to police immediately. Claim they all survived Ian's attacks through luck or intervention. The problem, no physical evidence, no wounds, testimony that would sound insane. Ian could potentially walk free. Option 2. Continue psychological torture until Ian confesses. Keep appearing in his life. Drive him to breakdown and admission. The problem, Risky, slow, and likely to cause Ian to attempt something desperate. Maybe mass casualties. Option 3. Orchestrated confrontation. Create a scenario where Ian confronts all his dead victims at once. Record his reaction and confession, involve police in a way that appeared legitimate. The problem required perfect timing and coordination. Option 4. Vigilante justice. Thomas didn't say this aloud, but everyone knew he was thinking it. The problem? They become killers themselves. Eleanor took over, facilitating the discussion with her decades of experience, mediating teenage drama and faculty disputes. Each person got to speak, to express their fears and desires, to be heard. Margaret admitted she just wanted to go home to her daughter, to live quietly and appreciate her second chance. She'd support whatever kept Ian from killing others, but didn't want revenge. Thomas wanted Ian to suffer, but acknowledged that personal vengeance might not be justice. He was willing to follow the group's lead. Rebecca believed God brought them back to witness to Ian, to offer him redemption even as they pursued justice. Her faith was unshakable, frustrating to some, but also admirable in its certainty. Harold could barely participate, still too traumatized to engage fully, but he managed to whisper that he trusted Eleanor and Connor to decide. David wanted action, strategy, a concrete plan with measurable outcomes. He was willing to take risks if the payoff was worth it. Eleanor wanted justice within the law, protection for everyone involved, and an end that allowed them all to return to their lives without exposure. Connor, when pressed to share his own desires, admitted with uncomfortable honesty, "I wanted entertainment. I was bored, and Ian gave me a puzzle to solve. But this stopped being fun when Harold came back screaming, 'Now, I want what you want. Justice, safety, closure, and maybe penance for turning your suffering into a game.'" The admission hung in the air, raw and honest. No one quite knew how to respond. They voted on each option. Option 1 got 2 votes. Option 2 got 0. Everyone agreed Ian was too dangerous for slow approaches. Option 4 got 1 vote from Thomas, who withdrew it when he saw the others' reactions and Margaret's horrified expression. Option 3, orchestrated confrontation, got 5 votes, with 1 abstention from Harold and 1 vote for whatever God wills from Rebecca, which Eleanor counted as agreement. The plan began to take shape through careful discussion. They'd create a scenario where Ian confronts all his victims simultaneously in a controlled environment, with police nearby. Connor would use his medical credentials and friendship with Chief Rodriguez to raise concerns about Ian's mental health beforehand, establishing a paper trail. When Ian confessed, and they believed he would when faced with the impossible, the police would already be alert to his instability. "It needs to be soon," David insisted, "before he kills someone else, before we lose control of the situation." Connor agreed. "Give me 3 days to set it up. I'll talk to Rodriguez, plant the seeds, arrange the location. Meanwhile, we keep watch on Ian. If he moves toward another victim, we intervene immediately." The group agreed, feeling something like relief at finally having direction. But Connor saw the doubt in their eyes, the exhaustion, the trauma still fresh. These were 6 people who died and come back, who were living in hiding, who were trusting an immortal necromancer to orchestrate their justice. He hoped he was worthy of that trust. After 4 centuries of running from responsibility, Connor McMasters was finally standing still long enough to face consequences, both Ian's and his own. As the meeting broke up, Jennifer Wu raised her hand tentatively from her corner. All eyes turned to her, the journalist who'd stumbled into their impossible story, who'd been watching and documenting, but barely speaking. "What happens after?" she asked quietly. "After Ian is caught? After you all come back to life publicly? How do you explain the resurrections?" The question stopped everyone cold. They'd been so focused on stopping Ian, on achieving justice, that they hadn't fully considered the aftermath. How do you explain to the world that you died and came back? What story could possibly make sense? Eleanor smiled grimly, though there was no humour in it. Very, very carefully. Connor looked around the room at the people he'd pulled back from death, at Jennifer, who now held their secrets, at the precarious situation his game had created. They had 3 days to stop a killer, to orchestrate a confrontation that would bring justice without exposure, to somehow return these people to their lives without the world discovering that resurrection was real and living in Millbrook, Vermont. "We'll need a cover story," David said, his analytical mind already working on the problem. "Something that explains why we're all alive without mentioning magic or resurrection." "Witness protection?" one of the others suggested. "We could claim we faked our deaths because Ian threatened us." 6 separate people faked their deaths at exactly the time Ian needed their properties. Thomas shook his head. "That sounds even crazier than the truth." "Medical mistakes," one of the other patients offered quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He'd been so quiet throughout the discussions. "We were all misdiagnosed as dead. Dr. McMasters discovered we were actually in comas, vegetative states, suspended animation. He revived us through experimental treatment." Connor considered it. That might work for 1 or 2 cases. But 5? The medical community would demand investigations. My credentials would be scrutinized. They'd want to know about these experimental treatments, to study the methodology. "You're immortal," Jennifer Wu pointed out. "You've probably accumulated enough knowledge over the years to fake something convincing." "Maybe." Connor wasn't convinced. But it invites attention we don't want. The kind of attention that asks deeper questions, that looks too closely at a doctor who's been practicing in the same small town for 15 years without aging. Eleanor stood up, her principal's decisiveness taking charge. "We're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we stop Ian. Then we worry about explanations, one crisis at a time." She moved around the table, placing a hand on various shoulders as she passed. Margaret's, Harold's, Rebecca's. Physical comfort, grounding. "For now, we focus on the immediate plan. Connor talks to Chief Rodriguez, establishes Ian's instability on record. Jennifer sets up recording equipment. The rest of us watch Ian, especially watching Mrs. Chen. And in 3 days, we confront him together." "What if he doesn't break?" Margaret asked, her voice small. "What if seeing us doesn't make him confess?" "Then we have recordings of him with 6 people he supposedly murdered," David said. "That's still evidence, even if he doesn't confess. It raises questions, starts investigations. The truth will come out eventually." "The truth has a way of surfacing," Rebecca added, her faith providing certainty where logic faltered. "We've been brought back for a purpose. That purpose will be fulfilled." Connor wished he shared her certainty. He'd seen truth buried, seen justice fail, seen innocent people suffer while guilty ones prospered. 400 years had taught him that the universe didn't guarantee happy endings. But looking at these 8 people, traumatized, exhausted, but still fighting for justice, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Hope, maybe naive, maybe foolish, but hope nonetheless. "Get some rest," he told them all. "We have a long 3 days ahead." As the group dispersed to their rooms, Connor stayed at the table with Eleanor. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd seen enough of life to know when words weren't needed. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "You're blaming yourself for all of this." Connor didn't deny it. "I turned their suffering into entertainment, used their deaths as pieces in a game. Harold screaming this morning. That's on me. I could have stopped Ian sooner. Should have." "Maybe." Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. "But you also brought us back. Gave us second chances. Most people don't get that, Connor. Most people who die stay dead." "Is that a gift or a curse?" Connor gestured toward Harold's room, where they could hear occasional sounds of restless movement. "Look at what it's cost him. Cost all of you." "That's Ian's cost, not yours. He's the killer. You're just the one who undid his work." Eleanor stood, stretched her back with an audible crack. "Stop wallowing in guilt and finish what you started. We need you focused, not regretful." She was right, of course. She usually was. Connor had spent centuries avoiding responsibility, avoiding attachments, avoiding consequences. But he'd involved himself in this situation deliberately. He'd resurrected these people, created this community, set this confrontation in motion. Now he had to see it through. "Thank you, Eleanor." "For what?" "For being the voice of reason when I'm being dramatic." She smiled, genuine warmth in her eyes. "Someone has to keep you grounded. Immortals get so wrapped up in their own heads." After she left, Connor sat alone in his dining room, watching November darkness settle over his farmhouse. Somewhere in town, Ian Martin was probably awake too, drinking perhaps. staring at documents and bank statements, convinced that 17 stab wounds would keep Harold Pemberton dead. 3 days until confrontation. 3 days to prepare, to plan, to get everyone in position. 3 days for Ian to potentially kill again, to target another victim, to add another name to the list of lives destroyed. Connor pulled out his phone, pulled up Chief Rodriguez's contact information. Tomorrow, he'd start planting seeds, establishing Ian's instability on record, creating the foundation for what was coming. Tonight, he'd simply sit in the darkness and contemplate the weight of lives saved and lives endangered. The endgame was approaching, and nobody, not Connor, not the victims, not Ian himself, was fully prepared for what would come next.